Okay, by now you know the basics of Darwin's greatest and most famous contribution to our understanding of the world, natural selection. But did you know that he's also the author of one of the most important books on earthworms and the way that they impact the world around us? Yes, well, now you do. Earthworms in the phylum Annelida are part of the bill of fare in this unit, so now is as good a time as any for us to talk about Darwin's worm obsession. First off, and before anyone asks, there is a valid reason for my decision to include this information, published in 1881 in a modern zoology class for non-major students. Actually, there are two reasons. The second we'll get to in the next video, also based on Darwin's worm book. My two motivations here are both related to the scientific method, and the first has the added benefit of reemphasizing, in somewhat more tangible terms, the concept of gradual changes accumulating into much larger things if given enough time. Darwin's fascination with worms began in 1837, when his uncle Josiah Wedgwood showed Darwin a field where he had spread cinders and chunks of limestone some 20 years earlier. He explained that the cinders and limestone seemed to have disappeared, but they are actually buried under 4 inches of new soil. Wedgwood was actually the one who suggested to Darwin that this was the work of earthworms. Now, Darwin had other things going on, but he did take up the study of worms on and off throughout the rest of his life. He found several other examples, locations where there are accurate records of how many years had passed since certain objects were put down on top of the soil surface. And he found that on average, and depending somewhat on the location, about 1/5 of an inch of soil per year was piling up and gradually burying the things that were once sitting right on top of the soil. Darwin did some pretty extensive further research, comparing notes with his contacts in other parts of the world, and he nicely documented that this phenomenon of new soil accumulation was pretty much the same everywhere that you had earthworms. Now, this wasn't the same, however, as establishing that earthworms were in fact the mechanism for this new soil accumulation. He suspected earthworms, but he could not rule out other causes. Was it necessarily earthworms doing this? Why not the accumulation of dust from the air? Or maybe animal poop was mixing with decaying vegetation, and this was gradually piling up at the top, making new soil. Let's say for now that these are 3 competing explanations for this buildup of new soil: worms, airborne dust, and poop. What could be done in order to distinguish between these 3 causes? Well, let's think for a moment like the good scientist that Darwin was. If you've ever dug a hole deep enough, for example, to plant a tree, you'll probably know that the soil layer containing organic matter, the good soil we sometimes call topsoil, is only the uppermost few inches. Below that, you get to clay or sediments or loose rock material overlying a layer of bedrock. Now, if it was the accumulation of earthworm castings that caused the buildup of soil over the long haul, then tiny bits of rock-like mineral material present in this new soil will be the same as whatever kind of earth was there underneath. In other words, there would be a strong match between the minerals in the soil with those that are directly below, the rock or the clay or whatever. If, however, it was airborne sediment, the minerals being deposited would have blown in from elsewhere and would not necessarily match the kind of dirt that was underneath. If it was animal poop and rotting vegetation, there wouldn't be much of any mineral material at all. It would be purely organic. Darwin noted that when new soil formed over chalky substrate, it was light in color because of the chalk particles that it contained. When you looked at an area where the underlying material was iron-rich, the new soil on the surface was also iron-rich. Basically, the little particles of rock in the new soil was always a good match with the chemistry of the parent material that was underneath. And this is enough evidence to exclude the 2 competing models of dust and poop, and to support Darwin's hypothesis that worms were bringing stuff up from the tunneling that they were doing below the soil line. Finally, there's the issue of evaluating plausibility. Darwin had documented soil buildup and provided further evidence in favor of earthworms as the cause. But is it really possible for stupid little earthworms to create a fifth of an inch of new soil each year? Well, Darwin anticipated this type of question, and he made sure that he had the relevant data. He is actually well known for being ultra meticulous about having lots of data before ever drawing a conclusion. Darwin had his contacts from around the world send him worm castings with descriptions of the conditions under which they were collected, and he carried out several measurements of his own. He estimated that, depending on a lot of things, including the density of worms, the kind of subsoil, the availability of water, and the amount of vegetation around, you could have between 7.5 to 18 tons of castings thrown up by worms per acre per year. And in the areas where he had documented a fifth of an inch of new soil deposition, the estimated dry mass of soil was almost right on for a fifth of an inch. And yes, an acre's worth of a fifth of an inch of topsoil really does weigh several tons. To summarize, Darwin's proposition that worm activity causes the soil to gradually rise up around paving stones, buildings, and even whole cities required evidence on three fronts. First, establishing that this slow burial was a gradual process that was going on at all times, including the present. Second, identifying worm activity as the most supported of the different possible explanatory mechanisms. Third, establishing that the amount of castings being thrown up by actual worms in their natural state is a good match for the rate of the slow burial. Darwin's work on this began in 1837, and the book was finally published in 1881, just a year before Darwin died. Now, in reading this particular volume of Darwin's life work, and in truth, it really amounts to a rather dull book on worms, I was struck mostly by the tremendous care with which Darwin presents and supports his basic proposition. While the effort of a single worm, or even a whole field of worms, seems like so little to anyone making day-to-day observations, the castings that they make accumulate over time, and ultimately they have a very profound effect in shaping the terrestrial landscape. Whole Roman cities get buried completely within 800 years, and enormous rocks of ancient places of Druid worship like Stonehenge are similarly buried by the soft soil brought up by the worms. To scholars of Darwin, the parallels are obvious between Darwin's worm book and his more famous work on evolutionary change by natural selection. Gradual change that seems so insignificant when one is looking at a population from one generation to the next can accumulate over 1,000 generations to make for really substantial amounts of evolutionary change. What I'll do in the next video is walk you through a worm-focused activity that Darwin did with one of his sons. It nicely illustrates another facet of the scientific approach to understanding the natural world, and by this I mean specifically manipulating variables in an experiment.